to just give you a few words about the Swedish Wind Center.
Sändningen tillgasar via havet ombord.
Just a reminder that please mute yourself if you are not given a word. Okay, some words about the Swedish Wind Center. Some of you may have heard about some different wind centers that was before. For example, we had something called the Swedish Wind Power Technology Center, and we had Stand Up for Wind. But these two centers have now joined forces together with Energiforsk, and we are now the Swedish Wind Center. So we encompassed 8 academic partners that works within wind power research. And we formally started last year, and we have a first stage will be for 5 years and up until 2027. So the Swedish Wind Center is led by Chalmers, Uppsala University and Energiforsk. So what is it that we do? Yeah, we facilitate research projects within wind power, and then we also share knowledge from previous and ongoing research projects. So these webinars that we are doing is a way to share what knowledge we have within the center and also outside of the center that we see that is interested in research topics. We have a couple of companies that are participating in the center, and more are welcome, of course, if you want to join. So these are the 10 companies and one authority that is members of the Swedish Wind Center today. We look at 5 different research themes that we see needs more research from the Wind Center perspective. And we try to see that we cover the whole lifetime of a turbine, from planning of wind power before you even build the turbines, how you do that. And this is also the focus of today's webinar. Then we have more about siting and wind resources to see where should I actually place turbines. Then from turbine technology part, looking at the turbine itself, new materials, reuse and recycling. And then, of course, also operation and maintenance. How can we use our turbines in a better way? And how can we also prolong the lifetime? And of course, without the electrical system integration, it doesn't matter if a turbine is up and running if we don't have somewhere to deliver the electricity. So these are just some examples on what research themes we see is interesting and necessary for the continued development of wind power. So if you're interested in knowing more about the Swedish Wind Center or you want to join, you can contact me, Stefanie Vanell and Åsa Elmqvist. And that was just the really short introduction to the Swedish Wind Center. And now I am more than happy to give a floor to Johan Köppel. So please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Sarah, and congratulations that this center has been started up. I'm pretty convinced within a few years that it will really make a difference. And of course, I'm glad that you did not forget the planning and the siting issues of wind power. Well, and as you all know, every energy usage comes with some footprint, and we need a change management to handle all this, especially as we are not only facing the climate crisis, but also a biodiversity crisis and the land take crisis. So this all needs to be handled, and I will address this from this planning and siting perspectives first. And this requires a lot of human resources, so good to have universities in that equation. And on the other hand, on the other side of the equation, there are also human resources, so the people who will face these changes in their landscapes, in their environment, in their places, and at best have some benefits of this change. And the second part of the equation will be covered from Adam mostly today. So let me share my screen, hopefully. Okay, so you can see the full screen right now?
Yes, it looks perfect.
Thank you, Sarah. So what I would like to do is to address some recent trends in the planning and permitting of wind energy. And I just, for my own justification as a guest lecturer, a guest professor at Uppsala University on the one hand, but with a German origin on the other hand. So why should I speak up here? I think this is a global issue we are facing here. And we always are looking on other countries or other regions and thinking, oh, this looks way less bureaucratic there to have wind power permitted and planned. So the question is really, is the grass always greener on the other side? And this incentivized me to start not even with Swedish or a German example. So I will start this kind of a patchwork of issues I will touch upon with a recent contribution from the United States. And here they realized as well in a few years how ever more zoning regulations, ever more ordinances in terms of setbacks of wind farms to settlements or buildings came up and so forth. There are overarching issues like the airspace interactions and the wildlife interactions. And especially the colleagues from NREL, they are doing a good job in trying to run scenarios what all this would mean, and would there be enough space for the wind energy development in order to meet the goals of deep decarbonization of the United States. So the topics seem all very familiar, and still the question is, are there any things we can learn from each other? And especially, of course, what does all this mean for the Swedish situation? I refer to, in my abstract, those who could read that, to this ever ongoing question on the time periods it takes to really plan and then finally have operating a wind farm. And I referred here to a comparative figure from Wind Europe, considering for the onshore wind energy, the permitting times. And at first glance, it would look like that Sweden is not on the bright side in these terms of the timelines. And it says, well, even in the last years, we realized that it takes ever longer, up to 8 years or even longer, for having a wind farm on the grid and operating. And I'm aware of the challenges and the pending challenges in Sweden as ever more appeals or the times at court, the often outdated comprehensive plans, military issues, and so forth. And there has been research done in recent years as well, for example, at KTH when it comes to the role of the municipal planning system, like Vincent Bradling's PhD, for example. There have been research projects like WeWind at KTH, for example, to test MCDA approaches and so forth. So this is the given situation. And if we then would look to Germany, it looks like a splendid performance. So very, at first glance, very short permitting lead times and so forth. And these figures, so the yellow bars here are the planning and authorization times. And what is surprising here, that it's not referring, at least in Germany, to the spatial planning processes, really running ahead of the siting permitting procedures, and for sure helping to facilitate to plan and site wind farms in Germany. So this first glance might be misleading in some way. As I mentioned, we know how day-to-day business runs in Swedish wind energy planning and permitting. We know the discussion through when it comes to the role of the municipalities and even the municipal veto, and that this vetoes often come too late, and too much needs to be invested beforehand, and that's really a barrier, obviously. And we can see all these fine-grained adjustment of these permitting procedures through the court's decision-making, and there are really topics which seem always hot, like the role of the military in that process. On the other hand, and this is when I came in closer contact with my Swedish colleagues in the year 2018, in that moment, we have really been jealous of this splendid Swedish wind energy strategy, which has been set up and then elaborated. And we were especially keen on approaches, what we can see here. First of all, there was a clear indication of what basically would be expected from every land or every region here in Sweden, and it was said, well, we need approximately 1.5% of this area, of these regions, and having some buffer in the planning area, first of all. And that was a good issue and a clear signal what would be relevant and expected here all over Sweden in terms of wind energy development. And it was nice to see these national classification. And on the one hand, there were no-go sites on class 3, and on the other hand, maybe very suitable areas. But of course, the majority of the land coverage of Sweden was in a kind of a middle range, saying, well, it should be possible to develop substantially wind energy here, but this has to be scrutinized further on, and especially not only on local levels, but also on regional levels. And this whole boost and this whole strategy in total was really a big move, I think. And we, as I said, it fell into times in Germany when we really faced some setbacks in the wind energy development. And I would like to shortly demonstrate that in a way. So I just have been speaking of that time period, and here you see with the gray bars, the annual new capacity having constructed on the grid in wind energy on land, be it from new turbines or from repowered one, the darker gray columns. And you see a major setback in these years. We even gave this setback a name. It was called the Altmaier barrier in a way. So that was the then Minister for Energy in Germany. Meaning that in that moment there was no national leadership, and they just let this go on and watch the development more passively. And on the other hand, we gained momentum again for onshore wind energy in the last years. And you might be asking, so how can this happen, or what kind of changes have been made even more recently to gain track here again and dynamic again in the wind energy development? And also, if you consider that in the electricity generation from wind turbines on land, it's substantial what we achieved then in Germany, up to 120 terawatt hours in 2023. So this is, on the one hand, a success story, and on the other hand, it's not enough in terms of the speed and velocity, because then the new government came up with very ambitious further goals for renewable energy and for onshore wind energy, not really tripling the current capacity of around 60 gigawatt, but 2.5-fold having an expansion in the next years. And then again, how can we manage this, and how can we help and support this via our planning and permitting system? And I will demonstrate a few issues which had to be overcome in the last year, gaining momentum again. And if you look on that map, this is a map in a regional scale where we mostly designate the sites where wind energy development is possible at all. These planning regions can cover even more than one county, 2 or 3 counties, and having 50 plus municipalities on board. And that's a nice approach in a way that everyone sits in the same board in that region and has to decide upon feasible sites for wind energy. But what happened with these established spatial planning tool we had in that in that regard, that it ever more developed to a negative planning approach. No? So you said, you cannot go here because of a distance to a settlement. You cannot go here because there are major restrictions from wildlife and so forth. And now it's important that it's differentiated between really federal law, mostly you cannot overcome, and then on the other hand, what a region itself can handle, and then coming up, for example, with ideas like these cross-hatched bluish lines here, the signature saying, well, we should not have a wind farm in between 2 existing ones within a 5-kilometer distance and so forth. So there's a lot of discretion in this regional level, and this is quite nice because it helps to balance the powers between national goals and local interests and so forth. But it came to a dead end in Germany in a way that it did not consider whether we can make up for enough wind energy in total then for the country. And then the big bang came with the Wind Energy Area Requirement Act in 2022, when we did nothing else what Sweden had already on its agenda with the National Wind Energy Strategy. We said for every state in Germany, approximately until 2032, you have to open up land for wind energy of approximately 2% of your states, and then the states delegate that to the regions. And the thing is, this is legally binding. And now a process set in that it shifted from a negative planning approach to a positive planning approach in a way to actually achieve these goals. And this is important, especially in a way that we can overcome this so-called free riding challenge. So if I'm a municipality, if I'm a region, why on earth should I open up a lot of land for wind energy if others need to contribute as well? And who is the institution who cares then that in total we would achieve our goals? And this is a way how we overcame this in Germany, at least in a way that now it's quite clear who has to contribute what. We have worked on that issues, on this balancing the powers from the local and the national level via these intermediate regional levels, and how to overcome this free riding challenge. And what is also important for more recent European developments is that if we designate lands on these regional levels, we're doing already a strategic environmental assessment. This is a precondition and should help to alleviate and facilitate the following planning and permitting steps for wind energy. Yes, and the same is still ongoing nicely in Sweden. It was clear from the onset that it was not done with just the national strategy, and even in the current situation in Germany, in Sweden, excuse me, I realize that it's still ongoing to explore the potential of the regional planning levels to support the municipalities in their positioning towards wind energy via more information on this regional level. And to my knowledge, there are currently at least 2 projects going on in Värmland and in Dalarna to explore the potential of these regions to support the municipalities and coming to common terms and find common sense in terms which areas of these regions might be more feasible for wind energy. And I assume that the strategy behind is that it really should better inform the municipalities beforehand. I have no clue of the final results and of these projects. I'm very curious for that. I think it should be finalized still this year. And then again, from an international perspective, this is quite interesting in another way. So I just introduced this very strict German way and saying these are legally binding sites then on a regional level. And the other way would be if it's more on an informal level. And I assume that's rather the humble Swedish way, say, in contrast to the rigid German approach. And we don't know which of these approaches really works better. So one question which seems quite obvious for me also for future research at the Swedish Wind Center would be how effectively can wind energy planning be supported between such governance levels. So this does for sure not come with surprise, but I see it's on the agenda in Sweden. Yes, and now turning to the permitting processes as initially introduced with this comparative approach of Wind Europe, how long it takes to have a wind farm or wind turbine planned and finally operating. And if we just have this in mind, so is really the grass so much greener on the other side, in that case in Germany, with seeming, due to Wind Europe, shorter permitting times in contrast to Sweden, we can see easily that it depends how you define the planning phases and so forth, and what is your database. And there was recently a nice research been done in Germany from the Fachagentur Wind. I will come back to that institution later. And they worked with surveys sent out to the wind farm developers on the one hand. Much work could be done with the national and state-wise EIA portals. So that is the European obligation that we would run in our EU member states central portals, where you can see all ongoing approval processes, and this has been established in Germany quite informative so far. It can always be done better, and I miss a similar system in Sweden to my knowledge. And we could also get information, or the researchers here could get information from the National Market Registry. So this is where you can see for wind and solar what kind of renewable energy facilities are on the grid, so to speak. And this all allowed to measure these planning times in the feasibility study phase and more the in-depth planning phase, then applying for the approval and finally getting the wind farm grid connected and operating. And then if you take all these times again together, then you have the same 8 years that we spoke of initially from Sweden. And this also raises questions. So is this hypothesis true that these spatial planning processes, the regional processes ahead, can really contribute to accelerate these processes and so forth? Yes. And then it depends a lot on details, and there was really a systematic review in the last years in Germany, which screws can we switch further on and to help to accelerate wind energy development and give it space in the landscape at all. And one thing was there was the political intention to come up with some innovations and updates when it comes to the substantial losses of area we are facing, I think not differently from Sweden when it comes to conflicts, potential conflicts with meteorological services. And then there was a big step done in Germany to say from 2024 on this year on the protection zones around the weather radar towers have been decreased a lot, and this opens up, I guess, about 16,000 more square kilometers for wind energy potential in Germany. And then the other thing was about air control, air traffic control. And here again, it has to do with lesser protection areas around the omnidirectional range stations, and this is being tracked from these Fachagentur wind on land. You can see this partially when these distances around these weather radar stations are decreasing. So this is another part how we can contribute to find sites for wind energy. So that would be another question, of course, which could be raised, or for sure that's already aware in the Swedish community here. To what extent can we find further approaches to consistently streamline these planning and permitting processes? Yes, and then we have this big topic. I cannot go into details today, and I think it's really a big thing what we have made out of that in Germany to harmonize these two issues of the climate and the biodiversity crisis. And here again, something has been amended recently, and this is also very interesting, I think, in an international context. So far, we had for our bird protection zones with eagles or ospreys playing a major role. It was in the hands of every state in Germany to define distances to breeding sites and so forth as no-go sites for wind energy, and this is really been done in Germany in a very rigid way. And then again, what has recently been done from a better national leadership again, this would then be the red lines areas here, which are lesser in size than the gray ones. That through a standardization, a national standardization on these buffer distances around breeding sites for a bunch of important species in Germany. This has contributed that in that case here in Brandenburg state, again, more space could be created for wind energy development with lesser restrictive protection zones, but still enough protection because this was a common action with the Federal Ministry of the Environment. So also in the wildlife arena, we can contribute. And I think here the overarching question is, how can we better integrate these climate policies, in our case via renewable wind energy, and especially the biodiversity regulations? And it makes sense to think of a better integration of both policies and regulations in a way that there are the long established nature and biodiversity protection regulations, and then came the newer kid on the block, the climate protection and the wind energy development. And of course, this takes time to mutually understand both policies and harmonize them. And this process for sure is still ongoing globally, and I think in Sweden as well. In my last, nearly last but one section in my patchwork presentation, I would like to address the offshore wind energy development. And I think this makes sense as we having the situation in Sweden just to really start out in a dynamic way from not so much having capacity for the time being, similar in Norway and so forth. And in contrast, Germany was a kind of a forerunner, and this, I guess it's like wind energy on land, still number 3 globally in terms of installed offshore wind capacity. And this process is very dynamic in terms of, say, public support for wind developers and wind industry to having the offshore wind farms established. And it's a a nicely tiered process, and this is why I would like to shed some light on that. This map simply demonstrates operating wind farms or those which are in construction or where already the results of the auction are clear, and the rights also for the grid connection have been granted, and this is all in development. On the other hand, we faced a similar development, so a dynamic growth initially, and then a slump, and not so much new installed capacity. And the goals here for offshore wind energy are very, very ambitious, meaning in a few steps from 2030 to 2045 at the end of the day, to raise this current around 9 gigawatt to 70 gigawatt installed offshore wind energy capacity. And then again, the question is, how can this happen? Because also the marine environments are complex, and all this needs to be well managed. And a few aspects of that issue shall be demonstrated right now. First of all, Germany has already its second marine spatial plan. So the first one was from 2009 and has been amended. And I think that was already a big deal, because we have really set aside approximately 30% of the exclusive economic zone, especially for the marine environment's protection. On the one hand, we have to consider dynamic navigation, shipping lines, and then having the red areas, wind farms in different priority zones, spatially allocated already. And then there's another regulation, which is a sibling, or was even the first sibling when it comes to clear development goals for how much offshore wind energy plus grid connection we would like to see when operating out there here, especially in the North Sea, in the exclusive economic zone. So a very demanding legislation which drives very dynamically the wind energy development, and it with the ever rising goals, how much offshore wind energy we would like to see established, there's a steady and a permanent amendment of these planning processes. So basically, these development zones snugly into the total spatial plan. And important again, for both plans, the total marine spatial plan plus these areas for offshore wind energy development called the site development plan. In both cases, we're doing the strategic environmental assessment already. And there's ever more reason why I'm so picky on this, having done an SEA on that levels. And many of you will be aware of these new possibility when the European Renewable Energy Directive has recently been amended, and there was introduced this idea of having acceleration areas for renewable energy is established, and it opens up for the EU member states this possibility. And the goals are ambitious, as you can read here. So for a new onshore wind project, having it permitted within a year, and a new offshore wind farm within 2 years, and have the time frames for repowering. So this is that would be a big thing, of course. And what are the preconditions? The preconditions is that you would have on levels before, on the spatial planning level, clear plans established where you could designate these acceleration areas, and the precondition is that you would have an SEA there running. And well, the assumed benefit for developers would be that if that's the case, you do not have to have full environmental impact assessment any longer on the local level, on the concrete approval level. You can imagine this raises criticism, but it does come with further obligations. So on the one hand, it would say, well, we would no longer define the killing or disturbance of species out there as deliberate, and it needed to be agreements on substantial mitigation measures and the monitoring of the effectiveness of the mitigation measures against harming wildlife. So this is the construct. Well, what if ever Sweden would go for these developments, and you can think this through for the time being. It's just a brain exercise. To my knowledge, it's not really a thing that actual steps have been ongoing in that direction, but the possibility is there. And now we could ask, would we have proper methods for dealing for whole regions with biodiversity issues, for example? And this is just a snapshot from research projects we have been involved as well. So it's for the red kite and the osprey. The idea is to defining concentration zones where you can have the core centers of the population protected, and on the other hand, there would be space for wind energy available, very shortly explained. And the thing is, this would be done on habitat modeling. So the figures here just illustrate how much grassland you need in a specific area for foraging of the red kite, say, how much forests and other criteria you could get mostly from remote sensing data. And of course, you have to calibrate and validate your model, but once you're doing that, you can train it. And it's a very small step forward towards, you could say, artificial intelligence approaches. So yes, maybe it's possible to cover these biodiversity aspects, at least for the most important species, already on that species, on that scale, in a way that it really could allow you to follow this acceleration approach of the Renewable Energy Directive of the European Union. And to finally underpin this for the offshore sector, once we have the designated sites for the offshore wind energy plus grid connection from the Marine Spatial Plan plus from the site development plan, the state, the public authority, the Federal Maritime Agency is doing even more. They're running kind of the feasibility studies for sites to be further developed here. And then everyone who goes to the auction and applies for a wind farm there has the same preconditions and the same set of information. So this information and this pre-information is publicly disclosed. It covers more or less everything you would do for a feasibility study for your wind farm anyway. I have here activated the meteorological considerations, or you can have the information on biodiversity, marine mammals and birds and whatever you need. So this is, I think, a major support for the wind farm developers. And now you could ask, having two plans beforehand, having two strategic environmental assessments beforehand, having this preliminary information, like very much important information for a feasibility study, could we then dare to enter this new acceleration regime of the European Union, which is open for Sweden basically as well? Yes, and just recently, end of February, this happened. So major offshore developers and industry like Ørsted, RWE and Vattenfall, they jointly campaigned and said with major environmental groups like BirdLife Germany, so to speak, the NABU, or the environmental NGO, the Deutsche Umwelthilfe, and they commonly said, oh no, at any rate, let's keep on and always have the environmental impact assessment on the local level as well, because this is an established instrument. We don't need to lose it and so forth. And we don't think the EIA is not responsible for longer permitting times. Yeah, I did not have the opportunity to dig deeper what triggered that. It came with some surprise. You could say this is simply power games, because the NGOs could go to the courts in many ways and challenge wind farms there. You could also say that practice and the real world doing things is not always keen on one innovation after the next, and is really happy to have some planning security for some time. That's the situation for the time being. And oh, excuse me, that was not what I wanted to do. Again, here we could say, what does this mean for Swedish Wind Center ideas for research? Again, it's on international benchmarks, and we could see developments elsewhere and see whether that would make sense for Sweden or not, or how. And my very last point, I see the timeline of my presentation as well, have it in mind. I mentioned some research and some information material from an institution where I think this can to some degree inspire the further development of the Swedish Wind Center in terms of planning and permitting, at least. It's a so-called Fachagentur Windenergie. Agentur means kind of Myndigheten, but it's not a public body, it's a non-profit organization, a Förening, and the membership is still different from what we can see of the Swedish Wind Center for the time being, but there's industry involved as well. There are municipal bodies involved, there are governments involved, and some of the industry, like Enercon or RWE or Ørsted onshore Germany. So it grew over time, and the benefits you can get from that institutions is, for example, then you get overviews what the different states are doing or the regions are doing. This is a nice comparison of distances you have to keep with a wind farm from settlements here in that example, or from protected sites or so, and often it already helps to display the differences in the states, and you could ask, why are these differences a given, or is there something to be improved? And even more, it's complicated in a way, but on the other hand, it's important what the agency is doing here. So we got in these new nature conservation regulations to harmonize it with the wind energy development. There's the introduction of a cap on the still feasible mitigation costs if you want to run a wind farm. So how much budget, how much of your annual revenue of electricity and then the finances you can make out of that, you have to at maximum to spend for these things for mitigation of wildlife harms. And then this agency comes up with even online calculation tools to facilitate these complicated regulations. And the same is a given when it comes then for a new national species restoration program, which has been set up to care for a complete mitigation hierarchy. I just wanted shortly to demonstrate these issues. And finally, what might all this further on mean? And I only could give you some inspirations from my comparative views. I'm pretty much sure that you know way better what kind of research topics might be raised in the planning and siting topics of the Swedish Wind Center. And just an idea would be, what about having a follow-up workshop someday with those who would be interested to really discuss the research priorities in that arena when it comes to planning or also siting of windcraft. That's an idea, and let's see how fruitful that might turn out. Thanks a lot, and Sarah, now we finally got it.
Thank you so much, Johan, for interesting presentation. Let's see if we have any questions or comments from the audience. see. I don't see anything in the Q&A or the chat. Yes, David, you had a question.
Yes, thank you for the presentation. I'm wondering, what you talked about a lot of like the state actors and municipal actors that are involved in the process and how they can affect it positively or negatively. Do you know, or is there any research on like the landowners themselves? Because in Sweden, obviously, we need to get. I mean, if we don't have the landowner approval, then we obviously can't build the site. Is that is there a problem of landowners not wanting to sign because they have negative feelings towards wind energy? I guess is my question. Is there a huge issue with that?
Well, so always think of the right of way and so forth, and there's some trouble ongoing in a way, but it's not the most pressing topic, I would say. So of course I did not address all the things what you could label acceptance of wind energy. That's not my term, acceptance. I prefer to speak of community benefits and so forth. But of course we are facing a major opposition to wind farm as well. And there has been done a lot of research in terms of understanding this. It's very similar like in Sweden. It has to do with right-winged tendencies and so forth. It's well organized. So it's not that there would not be resistance. I think a major weakness in Germany, in contrast to what I see globally, is I think we do not really address the community benefits effectively enough. So that's still a shortcoming, and I hope to learn from other countries. But it's not specifically that the landowners would not be open-minded for leasing land at the end of the day. So the prices for the leases raised substantially. It is there, but the big thing still is the species and the nature conservation issues, and that's the big thing which regulates wind energy in Germany dramatically.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, then we have Vincent Wetling.
Yes, thank you, Johan, for a great presentation. I think there are a lot of exciting topics that you present that could be worth pursuing. As you mentioned, I have a background within this field myself, and I was contemplating one of the sort of focus areas that I foresaw was the sort of, what should you say, the integration and the interaction between a sort of energy and climate planning policy domain and the spatial planning domain. Do you have any thoughts whether that is relevant sort of further pursue as well?
Yes, so if you really go back in history, and sometimes that helps. So where did especially our species regulation approaches come from? So this was the awareness of losses and so forth. And then when it comes to the deliberate killing or disturbing species, well, the basic figure, I think, was that people did or do to some degree weird things. So for example, on Malta, catching birds and having them in their pen. And from that direct move towards wildlife coming many regulations. And on the other hand, there have been sophisticated mitigation hierarchies developed. There's a huge and a well-integrated global community to come up with mitigation approaches and so forth, technologies, camera systems, and whatever, what you think. But there were American colleagues who said, well, you cannot blame the one side or the other side because they follow international conventions, they follow their regulations, and we are having global crisis in both ways. And then even when you think of the land consumption, land take, and there's also a new European restoration law, nature restoration law. So this is there. And if you always add up a new regulation or a new planning arena on an existing situation, as we faced it, for example, in Europe, when the national states gave ever more power to the European Union, then of course you cannot expect that these regulations and these different policies can very easily be harmonized. And I intended with some of my illustrations, with my examples, to demonstrate, if you look closer and scrutinize the issues in more detail, and make sure that it follows a clear rationale and having maybe national standards instead of that every region does what it wants, so to speak. That was a step towards that better integration, and you cannot see in our nature conservation law, where we transform all the European regulations, so many specific regulations as for wind energy. So there's no other land user who helped so much to make this ever more fine-grained, and this is a stepwise approach, and I think that's very important to continue and check whether this all works well and how that could be improved. I'm not sure whether I hit the core of your question.
Well, I think that those were interesting reflections. My remark was more in the clear contrast with the German approach is your more sort of binding quotas and a way to really enforce the build out and expansion. And as I foresee it, in Sweden, there are an ongoing debate to try and strengthen the sort of local energy planning and really come from that side. And I think there is a clear benefit to have it as a separate process where you can anchor some type of local objectives regarding energy production, for example, that then can influence and perhaps underpin the strategic spatial planning process. And maybe you can also find some ways to sort of have some mechanism that can be more enforcing as well in a way, but still anchored in the local democratic processes. So I think there's a lot to sort of investigate in this type of interplay, as I see it.
Yes, I definitely said this is very interesting, whether this might even be the more effective way. And on the other hand, it would not be fair to say that the German processes are not democratic, because it's always elaborated with the municipalities on board. But now this new regulation, which requires legally binding a specific amount of a region of land opened up, this was a big step, and I wondered, I did not realize a lot of opposition and resistance so far, and it would be very interesting to see what happens with a more conservative government again in Germany. But I think it has also to do with the different development phases. Now, I said we have already 120 terawatt hours currently for wind energy on land. As far as I know, it's the goal for Sweden is about 80 or so. And if you are already in such a dense situation, and then you're seeing a kind of some barriers, and it's not going on again. It was maybe a desperate step to come up with legally binding goals. On the other hand, it helped to tackle this free riding challenge, but it's for me definitely a topic of research and international comparison, so that we can ever more learn from different approaches and finding the best ways. And it's very interesting. I'm very curious on the outcomes of the current projects in Dalarna and Värmland, for example.
Yeah, I agree. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Any more questions for Johan? If you find when I have one question, maybe I was thinking about this the EU red amendment that for the offshore wind power, and I was wondering, do you see that Sweden will have to go to more a tender process in order to sort of fit into this amendment, rather than the process that we have today?
So basically, these renewable energy directives amendment applies both for offshore and onshore. But as you are asking, especially for the offshore sector, yeah, we're having this auction system in Sweden, not only offshore but also onshore in a way. And I think when again I compare this globally, how countries are approaching the marine space, the seascapes, you can see this move forward in Norway, for example, as well currently, or you can see this in the United States, and UK was a forerunner. And then basically, I think this falls under this topic of policy convergence. So it looks like they're going in the same way. And to my knowledge, also the current HAFS plan for Germany, for Sweden, is in a process of amendment. And what I have seen so far, there are many similar considerations how this marine area could be planned in more detail. When it comes to the auction systems, I think it helped to have this whole structured process. You have the marine spatial plans, you have these preliminary feasibility studies there. You can prioritize where to develop, when, in which year, and you can guarantee the grid connection, which was a major thing in the first years in Germany. You had offshore wind farms out there or wind turbines and no grid connection in that moment. And it's very structured now to plan this, and then it's a good interaction from the permitting, the planning and permitting agency. So that's this BSH, the Federal Maritime Agency, and the Bundesnetzagentur. So that's the grid agency, but does also the auctions for the on and offshore wind energy issues. And it looks to me as it's really all well integrated, and the floor would be open for a very dynamic development. On the other hand, we cannot be sure. So for the time being, the most dynamic step still need to be done. And I have my doubts that Germany could ever come up with 70 gigawatt installed capacity out there. Yeah, but there are interim goals. The first one is 2030. I think the governance and the regulation setting is there. The auctions seem to work so far. There's always strengths and weaknesses, of course. But that's not my position to say that's the best way for Sweden. So again, that we needed to discuss this together, and maybe that's an important point you raised for the research agenda, yes.
Okay, yeah. Ruth Lundberg, please.
Yes, thank you. First of all, I'm sorry for my English. I'm not super good at understanding everything, but there's one thing I really want to ask about, and this is for me quite similar to ecosystem services analysis. And that is a really, really tricky analysis, I would say, because of that nature always change, and especially now with the climate change. And so when you plan these areas, do you also look in the temporal perspective in the future? How different species will travel and change their habitats and so on? How have you included that in this analysis?
Yeah, a very important question, and the clear answer from my side, and I served in the scientific advisory board for this marine spatial plan amendment. We have not considered this enough at all. Not at all. We know all the food chains as, for example, well, the marine mammals need the fish, and the fish will follow habitat changes and so forth. And we discussed this in this planning processes, but it's really not well covered in these German plans for the time being. And this has major consequences. And there's also criticism, of course, that is think what all the baseline surveys currently are meaning now. We're putting so much effort into marine mammal mapping, fish mapping, and so forth, and the benthos and all such things, and it's static. It's not really handled in a way as it should be. On the other hand, it's clear, so everyone knows that, and there was also in the discussion that in the future we need shorter periods for the updates of these plans and for the amendments. And then again, the nature in the environmental groups, they are criticizing, should we then, considering such open questions, not move on slower? So we are now having these very dynamic plans for the offshore wind energy development, and they are saying, oh, maybe we are too fast because we do not realize these ecosystem changes sufficiently. So there's really heavy discourses, and you can see this with every amendment step. And my assessment is we have not covered this topic sufficiently, and maybe this contributes to my skepticism that we can ever get 70 gigawatt offshore wind energy installed there. And on the other hand, what would be the counterfactual narrative? What if we would not develop renewable energies dynamically, and what would that make then again with also the marine ecosystems? Think of of ocean warming and so forth. So it's complex, yeah. But you are right, this is a very important issue to be challenged, and again a research topic also for Sweden in a way here.
Okay, thank you, Johan. I think we need to let in Adam a bit, and if you have more questions to Johan, we can come back to them in the end. So with that, I say the floor is yours, Adam. Please, welcome.
Thank you very much. Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me to take part. Can you see my slides okay?
Yes, now we see them perfectly.
Great, okay. Yeah, so thank you. So my name is Adam Peacock. I'm a postdoctoral research fellow at the University of Exeter in the UK. And you're probably wondering why someone from the UK is here talking about Sweden. Well, we're actually part of Mr. Electrification Research Consortium, and I work on work package 4, which is about social acceptance. And when we first sat down to organise this webinar, I think we realised that we were going to be approaching this from 2 very different angles. And Johan has spoken a lot about the sort of the regulatory and governance aspects at the national level. I tend to view my research interests are more around perhaps what David was speaking to about the sort of landowners and affected communities within energy development and planning. And so what I wanted to do today was just to talk a bit more about what we mean by social acceptance, and then to draw on 2 pieces of research that I've done in my time over the last 2 years whilst part of Mr. Electrification. And the first one is looking at how national stakeholders are thinking about deploying different energy technologies, and I'll focus more on wind. And then to talk about what do I mean when I say place-based approach, and I'll draw from some research I just completed at the end of last year, which is to do with power line development, but I'll explain how that connects onto some future research on wind development in northern Sweden. So I guess I'll start with what do we mean by social acceptance? And I think there's this tendency to think about not in my backyard ways of thinking, NIMBYism as we call it. And that really is about people don't want to see energy developments. They don't want to look at the wind turbines. They don't want them close to them. And 2 decades of research have really challenged NIMBYism as a legitimate way of thinking, because there are so many different reactions that people can have to energy development. Some people are early adopters of different technologies, for instance, with solar. Some people will be really supportive, some people will resist, some people are really not bothered at all about energy development. So there's a whole spectrum of different reactions that we can have when we try to deploy wind energy or any kind of energy technology, really. And those reactions are founded upon different values and emotions. And I'll speak a bit more about where place comes into that later on. But we know that the way in which someone reacts initially to a project is often based off of what they've been told about the wind development project, and how emotionally attached they are to their local area and to their way of living, and how disruptive that's seen to be. And increasingly, as time has gone on, this table kind of shows how we've changed our perspectives on viewing social acceptance. And we've kind of reached this point now where we're thinking about social justice and actually the extent to which local community values are included, and those local voices are really heard within these energy development processes. And that really brings up ideas about issues of trust in companies and institutions, and what they imagine their agendas are within sort of a wider capitalist society. So if I could kind of emphasize any key point from this presentation, it's that we're really moving beyond this not in my backyard proximity based way of thinking about social acceptance and public and community reactions towards this more critical lens. So I won't spend too long on this, but this is kind of a diagram that we use to influence and determine really how we think about social acceptance. And social acceptance research has three key dimensions to it. At the bottom, we have the socio-political dimension, and I think that's largely what the first presentation was about. It's about sort of the regulatory context and legislative authorities and those sorts of things, policy directions, but also the stakeholders and the actors themselves that really drive these energy transitions and the deployment of energy technologies. And we know that within that, that national stakeholders can sometimes create what we call imagined publics, which is where they anticipate what the reactions to deploying energy technologies will be. And I won't speak too much about that, but when I refer to imagined publics, it's just how stakeholders anticipate reactions from the public. And we also then have the market sector, which is looking at flows of investment and production and consumption processes and individuals as consumers, buying, selling electricity. And then we have the community side of things, where we think about local context and local authorities and residents and affected landowners. And my research is really interested in the intersection of these different dimensions, these arrows, these flows between them, how we try to take national policy and put that, in terms of wind development, but that has to go somewhere. The turbines have to go somewhere. There will be some form of disruption, and I guess that intersection is particularly interesting. As a complete outsider to Sweden 2 years ago, we decided to start by really focusing on understanding what's happening at the national level. How are these different stakeholders thinking about the deployment of energy technologies? How can we represent that? And also, how can we better select specific case studies for more detailed community-based research later on? And so we asked ourselves quite broadly, firstly, how are these different stakeholders thinking about public acceptance, these imagined publics, and how is social acceptance or public acceptance seen to be an issue at the national level? And does that vary in different parts of Sweden? What are the key hotspots of energy developments, and how are they described? So how are these stakeholders describing the deployment of energy technologies across Sweden, and why are some technologies seen as better suited to certain places than others? And yeah, how does public acceptance vary across Sweden? To what extent do they generalize this issue of public acceptance Or do they really say, well, in this context, it's different to this context? So this is almost a national stakeholder view, which is kind of contrasting the place-based perspective that I'll talk about shortly. So we invited some really senior officials, stakeholders, to take part in this. And we were really just asking some very basic questions. Where are your current interests around deploying energy technologies? And thinking about the future, how do you see Sweden changing? And I won't speak too much about the future just because of time. But the important thing is that, firstly, we had a range of different stakeholders, and in particular the inclusion of civil society actors, third sector actors, including representatives from the Sami Council, anti-wind organisations, and All Sweden Shall Live. And the purpose of that is that thinking about this more critical lens on social acceptance, it's useful to have alternate perspectives in the data so that you can draw upon and really critique what you're seeing in a more general sense. As a geographer, my interest is spatial and thinking about spatial impacts. And in particular, one of my areas of expertise is in GIS, Geographic Information Systems or Science. And I find that if we're having a conversation about a national context and about different energy technologies, it's really useful to have them in front of you. And so we designed a research process where, when we were having online conversations, I had an open database. Now, some of this data is publicly available. Some of it I created myself through secondary research. And it meant that we were able to zoom in. We can zoom in far further than what you can see here, right down to individual turbines. And it just meant that we were able to, when we were asking about the current and future deployment of energy technologies, to really focus on specific areas and what the characteristics of those areas were, and perhaps what some of the challenges had been. And for anyone unfamiliar with GIS, it's useful to think of it as if you were building a piece of machinery or a building with different blueprints. So we take the physical world around us, and each layer represents a different, you can kind of stack them on top of each other, and they'll show you a different part of a different component of the system. So we transformed what we saw as the physical world into different layers and stacked them on top of each other. We then shared that with participants and enabled them to annotate over the map and draw our attention to specific cases, to really capture where they were focusing and to see if there was any similarities or differences between what people were saying and across sectors. To speak about the results, particularly interesting, you could always cut Sweden in half, and we found that there was a strong emphasis on deploying onshore wind and high voltage power lines across the country, as you can see on the left hand side. Hydrogen rather more concentrated in the north of the country, as well as mining, unsurprisingly, and solar very much in the south. And we found really strong evidence that the way in which public acceptance was perceived in its current form in Sweden and across Sweden matched up to this sort of north-south divide. You can see on the right-hand figure, we have the symbols that represent the different sectors that actors belong to, and we have whether they were talking about those examples in positive, neutral, or negative in response to public acceptance. And I think there is some diversity, but you can quite strongly see where I've almost cut a line across the map that public acceptance is very much seen to be different between the northern parts and the southern parts of Sweden. And we had these generalized quotes that accompanied these annotations. There is greater social acceptance in northern Sweden than there is in the south. There was never really a logical basis for that, but it was something that was strongly emphasized. People in the north accept more than people in the south. Again, this wasn't ever really in relation to one of these specific cases. It was just this generalized sentiment that existed. And then talking about the deployment of high voltage power lines in the south, acceptance always comes up in the south. We know it will. People are more interested in looking out for themselves. This description of this imagined public in the south as being more individualistic, almost more selfish, really, and a lot of NIMBYist dialogue accompany talking about people in the south. So I thought this was really interesting. This really shows how stakeholders see Sweden totally differently in terms of the public acceptance of deploying energy technologies. And these two areas that I've just marked on the map, I'll come back to later. They inform. The bottom one is the present study that I've just completed that I'll talk about, and the top one is the future research I'll be doing on wind energy in northern Sweden. And just to say that we can summarize the research by looking at how northern Sweden and southern Sweden were described, how different imagined publics were invoked to describe issues of public acceptance. And there was a really clear contrast, not just in terms of the technologies that were described, but these same spatial characteristics, the historical wealth. There was this idea that the north was more impoverished, and there was a need to address national wealth and redistribute national wealth. Electricity prices, unsurprisingly, were a really salient issue, particularly in southern Sweden, and how we address that. And then there were differences in terms of some of the environmental characteristics and demographic characteristics, and they're obviously quite easy to substantiate. Some of them were more interpretative. So the historical deployment of energy technologies. This was the idea that because there are large hydroelectric dams in the north of Sweden, people are more used to disruptions, and so public acceptance is higher. It's a more industrial area. People are less likely to engage in these sort of negative responses towards deploying energy technologies. Again, it's quite a large generalization, whereas in southern Sweden they've been kept away from proximity to these large infrastructures, despite having nuclear production in the south Sweden. So that contrast is really interesting to me, and it really hit home that this place-based perspective that I'm going to speak about wasn't very prevalent within and across Sweden and these stakeholders that we spoke to. So as I said, there's this prevalence of more NIMBY ways of thinking, this tendency to generalize the characteristics of populations. There was a lot of discussion about northern Sweden and how things were going to change. These strong narratives about reindustrialization and a hydrogen economy and rebalance in the north, and indeed there are conversations that we can relate to in the UK context as well. But we didn't really see that in terms of southern Sweden, despite acceptance being a more salient issue there. And I just think that's, in terms of thinking about future research directions, why is that the case, and what is the impact of that? But overall, we see that we're not really being very specific about what we mean by public acceptance. We're tending to generalize that. So to move away from that way of thinking, I'm going to introduce place-based perspectives. And it's a very different, more critical lens to thinking about social acceptance. So, as I said, I am a geographer. My PhD is in human geography, and I'm interested in the location of things. Everything has to go somewhere, and therefore, what are the implications of deploying wind turbines in different areas? Now, when we talk about place, we're talking about the variety of meanings and emotions associated with a location by individuals or collective groups. And it's this idea that where people live and the communities that exist, space isn't just a backdrop to other processes. It's a worldview. It's a way of thinking. It's how people navigate their own sense of worth and their own sense of existence, and people are attached to specific places for different reasons. People can define their identity based on different features in a place. If you think about conversations you have with friends from different areas, and how you might tend to talk about home and what home means to you, or how home might have changed, and that sense of place that you have for specific places. And this concept of place isn't new by any means. It's traceable back to the work of Aristotle, and it's of particular importance to literatures on environmental psychology, architecture, geography, sociology, all of which kind of emphasize the importance of thinking through this place-based lens. And what we say is that when an energy developer wants to deploy wind energy, they are going to disrupt someone's sense of place. Now, that might be in a positive way, as I said at the start. It could be in a negative way. Somebody could be totally indifferent to that, but it will. It's very likely that there will be some sort of reaction. And when that change occurs, and there is a threat to someone's identity or how attached they are to a place, we refer to that as a place protective action. And that's how people engage in behaviors that perhaps support the deployment of wind energy technologies, or to resist them. And so there are a couple of things we need to think about within that. So disruption to place is characterized by extent, rapidity, and control. So the rate and scale of change is important. How big of an impact will a wind farm have? Where will it have an impact? To whom? And in what ways? And how quickly is that change going to occur? How big of a wind farm are we talking? If we think then about how it unfolds over time as individuals make sense of what has happened or is about to happen, there's two dimensions to that. Firstly is what has been communicated to individuals. We always see with wind energy developments these sort of glossy brochures that are put together and sent to local residents or effective landowners. But they don't necessarily always hold the amount of information that somebody living in an area would want. They're not always very accessible. It's not always easy to understand what the implications of this are. So there's often a lack of clarity in some of these ways in which we present these wind energy projects, and how honest is it about potential impacts? You know, are there going to be significant local environmental impacts and or local economic impacts, and positive and negative, and what are those? People want to know how their place is going to change in the future. And when there is a communication deficit, we also then think about, well, how do people imagine other impacts? When you've been given, when you don't think that you've been given a sufficient amount of information, you start to turn to alternative ways of thinking. So how does this wind farm threaten their place attachment or their place identity? And that's where we tend to see real conflict start to brew. And then we have the final part of this, which is they attempt to cope accordingly. So how do people respond? You know, to what extent can they respond? Are there any mechanisms for public consultation within the proposal? There's a lot of local knowledge, local values that could easily be integrated into these planning systems. And to what extent is that even being listened to? Some people don't even have the time to commit to they could resist a wind development project, but you know, life is busy for everyone, and what evidence is there of particular social capital, individuals with lots of influence or free time in a community to be able to encourage support or resistance? And do they feel that they will be listened to if they do engage? And what impact does that have? So when we're thinking about place, we're really thinking about all these different factors here, and how they interrelate, and how they overall determine what we generalize as what you could describe as community acceptance, really. I took part in I conducted a really wonderful interview with someone from the third sector, and their quotes are kind of scattered around this because I think that they're incredibly powerful to what I'm trying to say. But In summary, a place-based approach is this idea that you need to scratch down to the bottom of the problem in each and every area. What is important to them? How will you disrupt their lives? And that takes time and it takes money. But now you know what to expect and you can work with them to find solutions on some of the issues. So a place-based perspective, a place-based approach is really about understanding local communities. And it doesn't necessarily mean that somebody has to live in an area to be affected. You know, in Sweden, for example, there's a lot of second home ownership and wind turbines being developed where someone has interest in a second home or in their log cabin. You don't necessarily have to live somewhere to be affected, and you can have a reaction to that. And we see a lot of issues with second home ownership and inciting reactions in the work that I've just completed. And I think you can kind of break this down very broadly into the disconnections between how stakeholders view a place and how they're appropriating a certain place, and how communities view their place, and to what extent are they both recognizing each other, and where are the disconnections between that. So I'm going to speak now about some work I just completed. I'm going to show you what a place-based approach looks like. And I'm going to draw from an example of a power line development, the Mungahamra power line development in around Västerås and Köping. And what I'm going to emphasize is firstly how stakeholders described this to me in these national interviews, and then what I learned from spending 2 months out there living with the affected landowners. So going back to our first map, there was this area here that was identified as a really significant bottleneck in terms of deploying power lines. So in the early stage in 2020, we started with the Mungahamra package, and they actually thought that the westernmost municipality would be the more difficult in terms of acceptance, but it ended up being the other way around, and that really interested me in terms of, well, what did they anticipate, and then what is the reality of those sort of lived experiences. And it's worth noting the impact that this this disruption is having. So the blue square there is part of Nord Syd, and it's TSO's Svenska Kraftnät developing that package. And these other annotations are actually regional reinforcements that need to be done. But because of the disruption going on where the blue square is, the ones in the red square can't be developed. So there is a chain reaction here to these processes and this need for electrification. And as we mentioned, without these enabling infrastructures in place, then these wind turbines, they really are ineffective. So I started off by asking, why do you think there is such low acceptance in this area? And we again saw these issues of generalizations. In the south, we have a really big NIMBY issue. They don't want the projects near them. Southern people don't want to look at wind turbines and power lines. It's about aesthetic. So again, emphasizing that this isn't really a very place-based approach. It's these generalizations about the public. Well, what did I find? As I said, I actually lived between these two municipalities for 2 months last year, 2 months and 2 weeks, I think. And to explain this map, there were 3 proposed routes for this power line, indicated by the red, purple, and orange shape files that we have. On the right-hand side is an existing substation, and the red dot is a proposed new substation, and you have the power line running through as the black dotted line. So with the knowledge in mind that there's this issue of supposedly this issue of NIMBYism, I started speaking to affected landowners. We went on driving interviews, so I actually visited lots of, as I'll show on the next slide, lots of different parts of this power line site. I had dinner with these people. I attended their meetings that they were having as like a board to object to this power line development. You know, I really try to get to the heart of how they think and what they've been told and what their understandings are. And so these are some of the reactions that they had, and it just shows this diversity when you get down to this place-based level. Why was the northern route selected? There were 3 routes proposed initially. Why was the northern one chosen? There had been no justification for that. What about the impact of the power lines on our local economy? Local tourism. So it's a really popular tourism area, Fjordhundreland, you may have visited. That's the brand that they use to kind of promote the area. And there's a lot of local businesses and local agriculture associated with that. And these rural people are going to be really, they're going to have a lot of disruption to their local economy because of this. And related to that, disruptions to the local cultural landscape, which attracts people to come visit. There were significant disruptions to the local environmental landscape, issues of biodiversity and endangered species, but also there's a lot of water protection areas in this region. And there were concerns based around, there'd previously been concerns about cement being found in water. And so, again, this was like a salient issue. Is this going to start up again? But that impact wasn't described. It's such a big area in terms of agriculture, particularly on the western side, and there's a lot of large-scale farming and disruptions about national food security. Should we compromise future energy developments? Sorry, should we compromise national food security for the sake of energy security? And what does that look like? Concerns about the power lines impacting using emergent technologies, drones and laser guidance systems in future agriculture. And then some issues around how this had been communicated and actually what these people could contribute and how they could help direct the power line development. Now, this isn't to say that that we should only ever prioritize local place-based perspectives, but I think there is benefit in taking a step back and actually looking at what local people say about their area and how they describe their area. For example, looking back historically in Sherping, there were a lot of free peasants in the area. They weren't really owned by nobility. The land, it's always been small scale farming. And there is historical evidence of them standing up to local authorities and reacting negatively throughout time. Now, those stories, that way of living in an area, that's passed down through generations and how you react. And this idea about inherited land and wanting to leave your land that you own for the next person in a better way than you found it, that was regularly brought up, where you don't see that on the Western side so much. And 90% of the negative reactions have actually been on the opposite side to what these stakeholders thought it would be, which I think is really interesting as well, this sort of general perspective looking down. But when you get down into a place-based approach, you see that's not the reality. And just to say, you know, as I mentioned, I went on I drove to all these parts on this map are all places that I visited along the proposed power line route. It's not been constructed yet. It's still in the permit acquisition phase. And these pictures just sort of represent that I was there visiting in person. So again, really spending time getting to the heart of the issue and getting to know what local people think. So that's what a place-based approach looks like. It's about understanding local values. It's about speaking to local people before we go in and say we want to develop this. It's about saying, well, you know, how do you live? What is it like living here? What's important about living here? And then bringing in this idea about future developments and the positive and negative reactions that could have. And I'm going to now talk about, just to summarize, what this means for some of the future research that I'll be doing on the social acceptance of wind energy. And I found this particular case really interesting. So looking at northern Sweden, you have, this is showing, so the blue dots are showing currently deployed wind energy, the orange dots are showing future clusters of wind energy deployment, those that are in progress in the permit system. And these are areas that were all identified to us. And you've got the blue municipalities that are highlighted here, are those that were seen as really positive to wind energy. And surprise, surprise, you can see there's already lots of wind energy. And then you've got this particular municipality to the west with absolutely nothing and was seen as declaring themselves as the first wind energy free municipality in Sweden. And I'm really interested to get to the bottom of that and to understand what it is that's emphasized there. What are the other values? It could be, as we saw in the Mongahamra study, around protection of local tourism or second homes, or so I'm going to be living in that area and really getting to the bottom of this really interesting distinction between these cases. And again, to draw on some quotes from the wonderful third sector interview that I conducted, we can't look at engagement with communities. A place-based approach means every place is different. And as this person emphasizes, every wind park in every surrounding, every community is unique. I work with companies and politicians. They say we did this, and we try hard to talk to the community, and it worked fine. So you've got a winning formula. But then they try to replicate this winning engagement approach, this winning formula somewhere else, and everyone's angry. Nothing's working. The permit process has been slowed. The veto has been invoked. And it's this idea that you can't generalize this. It's unique for each and every opportunity. And the only way to really understand that is to take a place-based lens. So in terms of thinking about future avenues for research, I'm really interested when I saw in the first presentation this idea about preliminary investigations of suitable sites. Well, how can we better integrate place-based perspectives in that process? And also, how can we integrate GIS? What tools would be seen as useful for developers and authorities to help communicate this better? And how can GIS and these social mapping approaches that I've developed support this? And how can we really challenge this dominant NIMBY perspective that I've seen in my data so often? And I think this quote is really ties everything together. What do you do when you do not feel that you've been listened to, when you're frustrated that you've been ignored, that you've not been consulted on the potential changes to where you live, that you've not been told as much as you think you should have? You find a bat and you make them listen. And that's what the veto is. It's a bat. It slows things down. It makes the people in charge notice, and it sends a message. Perhaps a slightly aggressive way of putting it, but that's how it's described. It's this idea that you've ignored my own place-specific values. I can influence the local politicians. We can veto on this. And again, this isn't just individuals. This is at the community level. It could be at the municipal level as well, as I said about the northern example that I'll be looking at. So thank you very much for your time. I think that's my speech done. Feel free to follow me on social media. Feel free to email me, and I'm always happy to talk about future research opportunities, and also to talk more widely about my research and place-based perspectives. And we'll have some publications coming soon. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Adam. Let's see if we have some questions. I think we had one in the chat. Elin Eriksson had a question about one of your earlier slides with the maps of Sweden with the division between north and south. And she's asking, is there a connection between positivity for acceptance in this map and who runs politically in the municipalities' regions, for example, green, red, blue, and brown?
Potentially, yeah. So that's not something that we focused on. My colleague in Mistra electrification, the other part of this work package, is looking at that issue specifically. So which municipalities across the country have said yes and no to wind power, and what are the different characteristics of them? And so that's taking place in terms of a national survey. There probably is, but I also think, speaking to Johan's talk at the start, there's a greater consolidation and collaboration of actors at the regional scale in the north. Argonne, for example, is this sort of idea to develop the green transition in the north, and you really see that happening, and a lot of positive ideas about reindustrialization and a green economy. And I think you're starting to see that elsewhere in the country. But no, I didn't focus specifically on the politics, but it's definitely an important dimension to this that we've not looked at just yet.
Okay, thank you. And we have Fredrik Hedenus.
Yeah, hey Adam, thank you very much for the presentation. So one question or hypothesis first, that they perceive the resistance to be more in southern Sweden compared to in northern Sweden. Could that partly be a pure function of population density? I mean, most people do not have time to engage in these processes, right? So if you have more people, the probability that someone who's engaged is larger, and when you have larger population density, you get more resistance. So I mean, it could be partly a function of only that. And secondly, this with place-based perspective, which I think is very relevant. But so if I understand the process, I mean, the companies need to have this consultations with the local community. They need to prove that they have listened to them in this way and that they have changed their plant according to their. So I mean, there's a process for this, right? But do you think this process is good enough, or how could it be improved to get the process going better?
Yeah, no, thank you. I was going to the first point on population density. Yes, inevitably, where you have more people, you're more likely to get conflict, and that is something that we saw. However, it doesn't necessarily mean that there will be. And I think the point I'm making is that just because there's higher population density, it doesn't mean that people necessarily have negative reactions just because there's more people. So while the chances of conflict increase purely based on the fact that there are more people, it's problematic to generalize that is the case all across southern Sweden when we know that specific context is really important. So yeah, there's a bit of a tension there. In terms of a consultation phase for place-based perspectives, I mean, we have seen, particularly in Ireland, and my colleague, Professor Patrick Devine-Wright, has been working on this issue for 20 years. And we've seen that when you take the time to include communities and to listen to them and their concerns and to have those legitimate conversations, it streamlines the process tenfold. I think there's a lot of work to do in terms of how you integrate that into the formal structures of the Swedish system at the municipal level. But I do think there's something to be done around, firstly, the identification of how places are different to one another. And there's a need for sort of a national data set almost that can kind of tell us that. And that's something I'm really interested in developing in particular. But also, it's not this idea that just because the local community say you shouldn't put this here, that doesn't make them right either. So there will be a whole swathe of legislative technical reasons why that can't be achieved, but that needs to be communicated clearly. And often we find that these perspectives are just sort of disregarded rather than having these legitimate conversations about what is and what isn't possible. And in some instances, yeah, there could be important learnings from local people, but yeah, I think looking at how we better integrate this is well, really should be a key research area. Does that answer your questions?
Yeah, roughly. It was more if there is some, I mean, the legislation, should the legislation be more precise? Because now it's rather open. I think that's probably why, since all projects are different, and this is a legislation for many different kinds of projects, right? So you basically need to do consultation, prove to the court that you did it in a proper way. So if I understand how, I just talked to some law people about this. And do you think there's something legislation-wise? I mean, one thing is that you can do the process better, right? I mean, the kind of craftsmanship on the ground. But is there something with the legislation that you think? I mean, it might be not be your specific area how to create legislation, but yeah, that was basically the question.
Yeah, I mean, my expertise isn't in creating legislation, but I mean, I will say that the direction I see calls for legislation is a lot around speeding up permit processes and repealing some of these. A lot of the conversation has been about repealing some of these really important democratic structures in Sweden, and I think that's really going actually the opposite direction. But yeah, it's not my area of expertise. But I think there's definitely something in that, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, let's move to David Mason.
Yeah, thanks for the presentation. I have a question. It feels like a lot of these, or like I guess the power that the public has, or on like a very local level, is really only to say no. Like you can't say, if a community wants something, you can't say yes and automatically get it. It's very, they have to look into research and invite investors maybe, but to say no, that's the it seems like the only power they have. So I'm wondering, do you think wind projects have just become like an easy target to say no? Because I mean, Sweden for the past 20 years has been really building out a lot of its wind energy, and so do you think this veto power is used disproportionately with wind? Are there other projects that are like types of projects that also get the same negative attention, or is it wind that actually just gets kind of more negative attention?
I think, well, a couple of thoughts on that. Firstly, I think looking at the lead up to the latest national election, political election, there was a really strong sentiment about nuclear versus wind that was kind of utilized by different parties. And I think that has perhaps exacerbated perspectives of reactions towards wind energy. And going back to the first question I had around sort of which way you are politically at the local level, there's probably some connection to that. What you've kind of pledged and promised your voters and your stance on wind power. I think there are different capacities for municipalities to engage on this issue. If you look at the example I gave around the power lines, the westernmost municipality has their own energy company. They have a lot of national clout, I would say. They're a much bigger city, and they have the capacity to engage on these issues and perhaps to take that more a sort of more forward approach to looking at this and what they want to change in the future in their local municipality. You have two individuals that are responsible for energy and climate related issues in the other municipality, and so there are fundamentally different capacities to have that forward looking approach to this. And I think that's really important to emphasize as well, is that it's not just about calling this local issues. It's like that it's not just about community reactions. It's also about the competence and the capacity of local authorities to deliver this, and the partnerships and relations.
It's like exercising control over or authority over, like, yeah, like self-determination over what you can do in your community.
Yeah, exactly. And if you lack the capacity to manage things day to day, if you're low on resources and you're just trying to hold things together, but if you have a lot of muscles to flex, then you're able to look at these issues more proactively. And
then
so
you
again,
have more power to choose. Yeah.
Yeah.
So you might be more positive because you feel like you have more control, which is how you were talking about with determination.
Exactly. Yeah. And that is very, very clear in the work that I just did. It's very, very clear to me that is a significant reason why. And I should have said really that the local politicians on the Enköping side have been actually quite supportive of the community protests, whereas that's not so much been the case in Västerås. So yeah, I think that's it's a really interesting conversation to be had about that. So I think in a way, yeah, wind power has perhaps become a bit of as I said, a bit of a bat to use to show this disapproval that our place-based perspectives aren't really being accounted for. But I think there's a lot more work to be done to sort of legitimize that claim.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, Elisabeth Ekenel.
Yes, hi. Thank you for an interesting presentation. I have my first question was potentially partly answered to, but I will pose it anyway, and that is this about not being listened to. I guess I assume that some of the perspectives that local stakeholders have will not be able to be heard or adapted to, and I guess there might be also conflicting perspectives from different local parts. So how do you handle sort of the disappointment then that actually you were not listened to, or you were listened to, but they didn't adapt to your views? And my second part question is, do you see any potential for this process that is now actually happening in Sweden for the first time? That's called citizen assemblies, where you sort of more dive deeply into, I mean, have a sort of a longer process where you actually have a more dive deeply into the topics and understand better.
Yeah. Sorry, you were cutting out a little bit there, but I think I got the gist of what you were asking. So on the first point about not being listened to, it's really important as a developer to be upfront and say, look, it's impossible to balance everything, but there is something to be said about establishing a legitimate process where you say, you know, you are heard. We understand what your reactions are, and they are legitimate. However, based on X, Y, and Z, all this different data that we have, and this is how we did it. There's a transparency about the approach that needs to be communicated and how decisions have been made. Then people are more receptive to that than just being ignored in the first place. And moreover, that provides almost a paper trail for developers to say, look, we've really explained this, and we're still getting this reaction. And it kind of adds some legitimacy to that as well, I think. So handling that disappointment, yes, is a big issue. It requires some slightly different engagement approaches, I would say, to the traditional standing on a stage presenting, and then that's kind of all people get, what you might call the bare legal minimum of engagement. It requires a longer term process of engagement, and you know, really communicating where you're at. If you communicate with a community right at the start of a project and then they don't hear from you for 2 years, it may well be that nothing particularly interesting has happened, but they'll fill that time and that space with alternate ideas about what's going on, and that can exacerbate issues. So even just communicating, look, we've heard you, we're looking into this, we will get back to you as soon as possible, is much better than saying nothing. So there's that kind of way of thinking about things as well. In terms of citizen assemblies, yes, there's something that, again, Patrick, my boss, has a lot of experience with, and I think they have a lot of potential. My critique of citizen assemblies is how you make them representative, and how you ensure that it's not just the loudest voices being heard, and how you ensure that you capture a range of different values. So you need oppositional voices as much as you need, you know, people perhaps even that don't believe in a green transition, as much as you have people that support it. And how do you balance that to make them truly reflective of that dimension? So I think there is opportunities within citizen assemblies to integrate some of this, but we are seeing criticisms of that sort towards them. Does that answer your questions?
Yes, thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, sorry. The next question comes from Christine Talbo.
Hi, thank you. My name is Christine Talbo. I work with business and human rights. So I just want, this is more a comment and an answer to Fredrik Edenius' question, and it also ties into what you talked about now, Adam. If we tie all of this to human rights, which are actually, you know, legal requirements and will be legal requirements with the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, if it's adopted. If it's not adopted, we're going to have 27 different member states with similar legislation. So there will be human rights due diligence also in Sweden eventually in the future. So if we tie this to human rights due diligence and looking at these things from a right to health, right to adequate standard of living, right to self-determination, etc., all of these are human rights. We can, you know, we can force a different way of communicating and working on these issues, because it's going to be legislation. We're going to be required to do meaningful stakeholder engagements. That's a human rights requirement, which includes two-way communication, includes in good faith, ongoing responsiveness, etc. And these things go above and beyond what the environmental codes say today. So Fredrik's question about is the legal framework in Sweden sufficient? No, it's not. The consultations that are done today are very formal, usually, and they are, we look at them as a compliance issue in relation to the environmental code, rather than looking at them as a compliance issue in relation to human rights. So when we start doing that, we're going to shift the way we're doing these things. So I actually think that things will be happening in the future. And I also think it's really important that the wind sector start looking at these things as human rights issues as such. I meet within, even in my company where I work, the perception of, do we even have human rights violations in Sweden? Yes, we do. And we have them around our wind farms. We have to start talking about that, because that's when we can address them from a legal perspective.
Yeah, I think I would emphasize a lot of the same things around meaningful communication, two-way flows. But yeah, thank you very much for contributing there, because it's not my area of expertise. So thanks for that.
Thank you. Time is running up, but I think if you, Berman, maybe take the last question from Niklas Haring as well.
Yes, thank you, Adam. Great talk. I learned a lot. I'm from the University of Gothenburg. I mostly study people's attitudes to other kinds of climate policies, or mostly people's attitudes to carbon pricing. So I'm quite new to this literature, but what I've understood is that you should be critical towards the unsophisticated NIMBY perspective, right? So I found this in several articles, and after your talk as well, I of course agree we need to consider more aspects to it and understand the place attachment and so forth. But when looking at your quotes, I understand that NIMBY could be some kind of derogatory term, right? But when you read the quotes there's, in its very basic sense, NIMBY would say that I want this kind of infrastructure, but I don't want it here. Is that also what you, to some extent, find? That people, they think that we need roads, power grids, renewable energy, but not in my community. And on that note, do people, if they are against wind turbines in their area, does that imply that they will also be more likely to be against wind turbines in other areas?
Yeah, good questions. So to speak to the first, it's important to note that in the power line research that I presented today, a lot of the residents weren't against having power lines. They wanted them digged down. So it's not necessarily about saying we don't want this here. It's almost, yeah, we know that we need more electricity. We understand Sweden's role as in exporting energy, and we know that the cities around us need to grow. We know that we need to electrify to decarbonize. But, does it have to be right here like this? Is the route as fixed as they're claiming it is, and why is that the case? And nobody's told them why. Can it be put in the ground? It's all farmland, so it would, although it would be 4 times more expensive, I imagine. It's not impossible, but there are obviously cost and technical implications towards that. So, in a way, whilst people can engage in what we call these place protective actions, and that is kind of reflective of this NIMBY idea, I think the difference is that the NIMBY idea tends to almost dismiss the whole spectrum of different reactions and different values people can have, and marginalize them as they just don't want it near them. When actually, if we're going to engage in legitimate and meaningful conversations about these future developments, we need to think more broadly about these issues. So that's the sort of difference, I think, between them. If that answers the first question. Now, the idea that somebody, if they're against wind developments in their area, will be against wind developments more generally, or perhaps in other places. Well, there's two ways of looking at that. Well, multiple ways of looking at it, but one is, what is their perspective on wind energy in general? I mentioned about this sort of wind versus nuclear debate that was being had in national politics. So which way do they look at that? I interviewed someone from the anti-wind organization in Sweden who has this blanket view of, we don't need wind energy, it destroys the landscape, it destroys local environments. I don't think that kind of perspective is any more helpful than we should put wind energy everywhere. So there's something to be said about balancing both ends of the spectrum there. And so, yeah, that probably could be the case. I mean, I don't know that I would want to say definitively, but it doesn't necessarily also relate to the technology. It could be the way in which you've been approached about the project. And in the example of the power line, actually the engagement approach that was taken was to set up multiple different stalls, and you could queue up depending on your question that you had, but you could get to the front of a queue and then be told you had to queue at another stall in order to get your question answered because it wasn't their area of expertise. Now that just really wound people up. And a lot of what I see now in that project isn't even about the power line anymore, so to speak. It's an anger with the people that are trying to deploy it. And they describe themselves, they've got a group called Dig Down, Gravner, and they describe themselves as a war council. It's completely gone to there's been a huge deficit of engagement and communication. So the point being that it's not always then just about the technology as to why people react. So you could see a developer that you don't like somewhere and then be against that project by default. So it's not always just about the technology itself. You could also have environmental values where you say, you know, that's a really important area of national park that I don't think should be affected. So it's more complicated than that, I think. Does that answer your questions?
Yeah, I think so. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, we are a bit past 11, so I think we close the question session. So thank you very much, Adam and Johan, for interesting presentations, and thank you for all the participants for interesting questions and to listen to everything today. So with that, I thank you all, and I close this webinar from the Swedish Wind Center. So thank you.